Stephen the Sword Fighter is the first episode where we see that one of the crystal gems poof from existence, mainly disappearing while only being a gem rather than being transformed into what they are in the show. And to tell you the truth, considering of how that Paul is literally the first character who experienced this, and the fact that she is getting development along the way, I'm gonna be real with you, with her techniques of teaching Steven as a sword fighter, it kinda shows onto why Connie ended up becoming the sword fighter in season 2. The Crystal Gems watch a movie called Lonely Blades 4, which contains sword fighting, and Paul doesn't like anything that happens because of how fake it is, and considering that she is a sword fighter, she'll teach Steven on how sword fighting is really important and a lot more difficult to handle rather than what you see from a movie or on TV. Paul summons a hologram of herself in order to show demonstrations on being a sword fighter, but when Paul is telling Steven the importance of sword fighting, her hologram stabs her, causing her to poof from her form and back into just a regular gem, with no other way to transform back into one until she gets the energy. I need to be really honest with you, with this episode being mainly Steven just trying to have the hologram be her Paul, like the same Paul as before, and even though it may be uninspiring writing, I need to be really honest with you, judging of how Steven just doesn't have a life like everyone else's, and he mostly relies on the crystal gems, he literally has no other choice. I get the impression from this episode is that hologram Paul is nowhere near as the regular Paul, which is an indication that the character, mainly Steven, is just trying to find a replacement Paul, but as far as I'm concerned, it really feels like a serious scenario when you realize that when a gem is no longer in a form after being completely disappeared due to a huge critical attack, you can tell that Steven, even if he is mostly funny in this episode, can't be able to understand the seriousness when it comes to the abilities of what the crystal gems have. Granted, he's impressed by them, but at the same time, when it comes to incidents like the hologram Paul, he is still new to most of this stuff, to the point that I'm honestly surprised that him just taking this a lot more simpler rather than other children who will probably see this as tragically when it comes to the mothers being impaled or worse, then as far as I'm concerned, I'm pretty sure that any other human in this show won't be able to take it easy, especially when it comes to Connie or the other characters from Beach City. I know that this episode is supposed to be comedic when it comes to Steven just trying to go adjustment to the hologram Paul, but as far as I'm concerned, knowing full well that this episode took a turn when it comes to one of the gems being poofed from existence, when it comes to them being only the gem and not themselves, I'm sorry, I just don't know how to establish this correctly. It's really a struggle for anyone who will probably experience this, and just seeing Steven in this position, to tell you the truth, it will probably be a lot more complicated for Steven to go through a scenario once he realizes that when a gem is poof, he needs to find some different solutions in order to put them back to the way they were, or just taking things into his own hands by taking down the hologram Paul, which he ends up doing later on in this episode. The only thing that feels like false advertising is the title, with it calling Steven the Sword Fighter, even though that Steven doesn't do any sword training whatsoever, since that he only watches Paul showing the training, and when it comes to him using a mop to defend himself, it doesn't qualify as training because he still defends himself with his shield, and when it comes to the scenario where he takes down hologram Paul that has nothing to do with sword fighting, it really feels like that this episode would have been titled something different rather than Steven the Sword Fighter. The way he stops hologram Paul isn't stabbing the chest, even though that it it shows that the mop is through the chest. He threw the broom, the mop, like a boomerang, and it stops hologram Paul. So no, it doesn't qualify as stabbing if Steven doesn't use the mop to go through Paul. So for me personally, this title episode, the title of this episode really feels like false advertising, but that doesn't automatically mean that this episode is bad. It's still good. Anyway, with Paul regenerating, with the episode ending with a funny note of Paul saying, "Oh, I can't leave you guys alone for a second." It's a good ending for humorous it was, but since that this is the beginning of the Crystal Gems game development when it comes to disappearing and regenerating, or some swords when it comes to Garnet's abilities, or Amethyst. Believe me when I say this, I'm honestly looking forward to talking about these types of episodes when it comes to the Crystal Gems. With the first or next being Garnet that ends up happening way late in the season, but we still have a long way. I'm giving this episode a 7.5 out of 10.